Hello, I'm Dr. Nick Gordon. Zen Buddhism was introduced to Japan from the mainland probably as early as the 7th century, but it really began to grow in influence from the 12th century. In a time of political struggle for the archipelago and the growth of an elite warrior class, its ideas had a strong cultural resonance. Zen holds that meditation offers a clear path to enlightenment, a way to consider the world around us, understand its unpredictable and even absurd nature, and so navigate a way of life that allows for compassion and understanding. Its associated art forms of tea ceremony, ceramics, calligraphy, and gardening were a foil for the difficult and very political life that Zen adherents often experienced. In this episode, Dr. Kathleen Olive takes one famous Zen garden in Kyoto as a way to understand the role of meditation in appreciating works of art. Good morning, Kathleen.
Hi, Nick.
So today you're taking us to a spectacular and very special garden in Japan. Would you mind first telling us a little bit about where you're going to be taking us today?
So today we are in Kyoto, the ancient imperial capital of Japan, still seen in some ways as the kind of heartland of traditional arts and crafts and high culture in Japan, so much so that its nickname actually is the Florence of Japan. So today we're in Kyoto and we're at a temple in Kyoto that in English we would call the Temple of the Dragon at Peace, but which we refer to by its Japanese name, which is Ryoan-ji. The G on the end is the reference to this being a temple. So this is a small Zen temple in the northwest of Kyoto.
And it does look beautifully serene. And if you look it up for images of this temple online, you'll see exactly how serene it is with this beautiful arrangement of gardens surrounding this particular temple. But what makes this temple so special?
Serene. I love that you've chosen the word serene. I find this temple very serene as well. I mean, we can talk about whether that was the intention of the people who put this garden together, whether they wanted us to feel serene, whether they wanted us to feel reflective, whether they actually wanted us to feel a sense of the turmoil of life. That's all still very much debated. But I think some people would actually not describe this garden as serene at all. I think for some people there's a real block to looking at this and even calling it a garden because the elements of it are so simple. So this is designed as a space around the hojo or residence of the abbot of this particular small Zen temple. And it was designed as, we could see it almost as an aid to meditation. So that was the purpose of this garden.
And what are these elements then that we're looking at? It's
so simple really that we can just use nouns to describe this garden. We have white gravel, we have larger grey rocks in a very small concentration of larger grey rocks like a border, and we have precisely 15 craggy rocks of small sizes, but varying small sizes, which are carefully placed. And I don't think too many people would disagree on seeing this garden that it's not a random placement of those larger stones. They're carefully placed on beds of earth that are now covered with moss. And then the other materials that we have here are clay. We have a clay packed wall that gives a back to this garden. And we have a wooden roof on the clay wall. And that's pretty much the entire components of this garden, which is why some people would probably struggle to recognise this as a garden, as the only plant really is the moss.
So we have a very different range of elements than what we might expect. So what then makes this a garden rather than a collection of nouns?
Well, I don't even know, Nick, if I can answer that question. It's a garden for the Japanese tradition, but it's a very specific type of garden in the Japanese history of gardening. So Japanese, I won't go into it at length, but Japanese has many different words for garden. And the particular word used for this garden is literally withered mountain rock. So we would translate this style of garden as a Zen garden. It's associated with Zen Buddhism, this dry, raked gravel, stone, simple form of garden, which can have plants, doesn't here at Ryoan-ji, but can include plantings, very simple, careful plantings. But that name for it in Japanese of withered mountain rock tells you that those are the main components of a garden like this. It is about a landscape. So the other word we often use for this in English would be a dry landscape garden. And I think we're quite used to banal versions of these, tucked into the corner of an airport terminal, or those terrible little miniature ones that 1980s corporate guys were, encouraged to rake with a miniature rake on their desk in between, making really big financial decisions. So I think we are used to seeing them in somewhat of a banal manner now, thanks to the way they've been understood in the West. But these really grew in popularity in Japan in the 15th and 16th centuries in particular, and they are considered so representative of Zen Buddhism and the various art forms that surrounded it that this one is actually World Heritage listed. So this particular garden has UNESCO World Heritage status.
So if we were then to just thinking back to what you were saying earlier about what was the intention of this garden, what was it meant to evoke in us as we sit here in front of it and contemplate it? So what was it created to inspire in us or to provoke in us?
Well, I think you've actually just encapsulated the intent of this garden. So as I said, it unfolds around three sides of the abbot's residence, the place where the head chief monk of this particular Zen monastery lived. Abbot's residences or hojo, they tend to have a veranda around them. I mean, most traditional Japanese architecture does have a veranda component. Certainly the residence of the head monk is no different. You can't see the veranda in the image that we've chosen, but it's just to the left of the modern tiling that you can see. It's a low wooden veranda that you kneel on, essentially. You sit on it by kneeling. And you contemplate the garden. And Zen Buddhism isn't prescriptive in meditation. There are many different types of meditation in Zen Buddhism, ranging from what we would today call something like guided meditation to calligraphic meditation exercises to, even in some sects of Zen Buddhism, to physical discipline as meditation. So being unexpectedly hit by the abbot with a hard stick or running in kind of endurance tests, running in the middle of the night through difficult forests in the mountains to the north of Kyoto and pushing your body to its physical utmost in order to reach a meditative state. So it's not prescriptive. There are many different ways to achieve enlightenment through meditation. And so I think the intent of this garden is just to offer you another path to enlightenment, that you would sit and look at these stones and contemplate a possible meaning for them. And we can talk about the possible meaning of this arrangement of stones. But it is just a contemplation exercise. So it is really emptying your mind of conscious threads of thought and making space for what might arrive under those conditions.
And it's wonderful then, it seems, that a garden like this does give you those with the withered mountain rocks to focus on. And when you look at them, it does make that negative space of the white gravel really open up and become quite expansive.
Negative space is a huge concept in traditional Japanese, well, not even traditional Japanese art and aesthetics. If you think about very contemporary forms of Japanese art, negative space, I think, is a really important concept for thinking about and talking about this garden and what it does to you. Negative space is a big thing in Japanese art and aesthetics, both traditional and contemporary anyway. But as you say, when you look at this garden, when you look at that expanse of white gravel opening up before your eyes, it gives your eyes something to move into. And as your eyes move into that space, they find actually very little. They find 15 rocks. Some people see these rocks as being very symbolic, being a symbolic representation of tiger cubs crossing a difficult, treacherous body of water with their mother, so that the body of water in that kind of symbolic scenario would be the raked gravel, and the smaller groupings of stones are the tiger cubs following their mother across the expanse of gravel. But we know that actually this garden, which seems to have been established in the late 15th century, after this complex transformed from being a private aristocratic villa into a Zen temple, which was something that happened in quite a few places in Kyoto in the 15th century, that large estates became small Zen in particular Zen temples. We know that originally in the first descriptions of this garden there are in fact only 9 stones. So there's much debate about when the 15 arrive, and was it the 9 stones that represented the tiger cubs crossing the water? Is it the 15 stones? Do they represent something else? You can't see all of the 15 stones at once. When you look at this garden, you have to move around a little bit and really look for the final 15th stone. So some people say that the true enlightenment of looking upon this garden only comes when you can identify where the 15th stone is hiding. But really, if we were to be honest, we would say there's very little here for the eye to look at. And the thing that I find so tremendously powerful about the design of this garden is that clay-packed fence forces you to keep looking back into the garden, especially because of that sloping roof, the shingle roof on that fence. You know, that roof serves no purpose. The fence doesn't need protection from the rain. It's not preventing people from climbing in. But the visual purpose of that little shingle roof is to force your eyes to keep coming back down into the garden. And that's a tension for your eyes because, as you can see, beyond this garden are very seasonal trees. You've got cherries, you've got maples. So in springtime, your eye is going to want to look at profusion of blossom. In summer, you're going to want to look at vivid greens. In autumn, it's just a flash of orange and russet beyond that fence. But your eye is forced always by that little roof and by the lack of colour and the lack of interest in that garden. It's forced to keep coming back to the place that you have to empty your mind and eye out to look upon. It's a very, very cleverly designed garden, but we don't even know by whom.
Which is fascinating in itself. And that's sort of, you can see why people would spend so much time trying to interpret this garden and its meaning, the way it's creating that almost a false horizon, separating you as the viewer on the veranda from that rich, attractive world beyond the fence, quite literally over the fence. But yeah, so how is it a garden that has been interpreted in different ways across the centuries?
Yeah, it has been. So one way is exactly what you just explained. You know, Zen Buddhism says, or Buddhism in general says, that the world is full of highly attractive, highly tempting things, but they're just an illusion. They just pass away. They don't have any kind of permanence to them. And so we shouldn't be distracted by the highly illusory pleasures of the world around us. We should instead focus on the true nature of our existence and hope in that way to reach enlightenment. So that's one way to understand this garden, is that it in fact reflects that tension for a Buddhist, that the world is full of all of the pleasures of the so-called floating world, but those are transient, and instead we need to focus on the harder truths. Some would say even the absurd truths of the world around us, and certainly some people would read this then as an absurdist garden in that way. There are those people who take the very literal interpretation of the rocks as a metaphor, like the raked gravel bed, which is raked by the monks more or less every day in order to keep it as pristine as you see here. But then there are scientists who have conducted tests on the design of this garden, because you might be looking at this image and thinking there's nothing here, but when you come to this garden and you do sit down at veranda level and you spend some time, especially I would say if you arrive as early as possible, 8 a.m. if you can bear it when the temple opens, before hordes of people arrive, and you give yourself that quiet moment. It is true that it works some kind of magic on you, a visual magic. Some people might not feel the meditative magic, but certainly a visual magic. And so scientists have analysed the structure of the design of the rocks in this garden as seen by someone sitting in the centre of the veranda where the abbot would have sat, so the person with the primary kind of vision over this garden. And they've found that the rocks are very carefully placed. It's not a random assortment of rock groupings. In fact, they unfurl in the same kind of fractal way that branches grow off a tree. It looks random, but we all know from science that in fact it's not random. It's a very careful process of design that's built within nature. And these rocks are placed in in the exact same system, with the abbot's point of view being the branch then that unfolds out into the garden and gives us the placement of these rocks. Very, very careful. And the Japanese garden designers over time were very interested in rocks. Patrons of great Japanese gardens like emperors would personally go to quarries and oversee, a bit like Michelangelo in Carrara, the choice of the rocks that they were going to have for their gardens. So rocks are never just rocks in a Japanese garden. They're much more important than that. But there's absolutely no evidence that the monks of this particular small Zen temple had anything to do with the garden design. There's in fact strong evidence that they had nothing to do with the garden design, and that these rocks were actually placed in this arrangement by the very men and almost untouchable class of people, the men who quarried these rocks. Those masons seem to be the ones who have decided where to place the rocks, and in some cases actually leave a type of a signature upon them. So the other fascinating aspect of this garden is that we see it now as such a manifestation of high art and high design, but in fact it seems to be the result sometime in the 16th or 17th century of craftsmen who were not even dignified with a name or a social status, and yet they understood the principles of Japanese design so clearly.
Which is in itself extraordinary, given that it seems that kind of the placement of the rocks is not accidental. It's a design principle behind it, and that design principle embodies a philosophy, which is quite extraordinary. Just thinking then, kind of, if we kind of don't know so much about the origins of the garden, were the sort of the striations that are raked into the gravel something that we think has always been there, or do those striations change? Are different patterns put in, or?
No. So this is a question people often ask about the withered mountain rock gardens in Kyoto. This is maybe the most famous, but Kyoto is the best place to see this style of garden. In fact, there's quite a lot of them that survive, and it's one of the first questions people ask. So in the case of Ryoan-ji, we have little ink illustrations made of this garden as far back as the 17th century, and these were the designs that were being raked into the gravel. So we can't really trace the history of this garden before the 16th century. We know when the temple was built. We know when a first garden was put in. Archaeologists have looked at the history of the wall. The wall is the last element to go in. So before the wall goes in, your eye could roam straight from the gravel to the trees beyond. So at some point later in maybe the 17th century, that wall goes in with oil mixed in the clay to give it that beautiful patina emerging unpredictably over time, as you see. But no, as long as we know, these are the designs that have been raked into the gravel. And the gravel designs, they have to be remade over time. In some temples, they're raked every day. In other temples, they might be re-raked once a week just to keep them clean and pristine. But a really magical thing about, and an unexpected thing about visiting a gravel garden such as this one is what happens to all those tiny pieces of gravel when it rains. They move, they're not bedded down, they're quite loose. They've been raked loosely into position, and they actually begin to dance when they're struck by raindrops.
Oh wow, that would be wow. It would make it feel even more like it's tiger cubs crossing a river. So you mentioned that there are many other gardens such as this in Kyoto. Are there any modern gardens in Kyoto that are inspired by this?
Yes, there are, and not just in Kyoto, throughout the world. In fact, this is probably the most influential of the Zen garden designs that we have. So it's been used as an inspiration for other Zen gardens, particularly in North America. And there are other Zen gardens, modern Zen gardens in Kyoto that really pick up of the long-running influence of this particular garden. And the most important modern Japanese garden designer who has been inspired not just by Ryoan-ji but also by other withered mountain rock gardens in Kyoto is a designer called Mirei Shigemori, who had made in the 20th century a number of designs for Zen rock gardens that are explicitly based on the components of this particular garden and that fractal arrangement of the rock placings here. And you can, in fact, in Kyoto, visit his personal house and garden, which is in the northeast of the city of Kyoto, kind of directly on the other side of the city to this particular garden. And that's a wonderful experience that I would recommend as highly as visiting this one.
And just perhaps a final question or a reflection. So you've seen many of the great gardens around the world, across several continents. and they're all very, very different. But is there something about this garden that gives you a particular personal response, perhaps, to?
I think the thing I really value about this garden is that as someone with a love of Western gardens and someone who, like many people listening, I'm sure, grew up in a family of people who enjoyed gardening in a very Western style. The thing that I appreciate about this garden is that it actually makes me work quite hard from a kind of a philosophical point of view, just to initially accept this as a garden when it's devoid of so many of the components that someone like my grandmother would have appreciated in a garden. But once I do make space to take this garden on its own terms, both in its history and in its cultural contexts, once you do allow your mind and eye to move into this garden, I agree with your comment from the beginning. I do find this an extremely serene garden that does slow the heartbeat down, that does lower the blood pressure and really create for you a context in which you can sit, appreciate, admire, reflect. And in fact, there's not very much heavy lifting to do to admire this garden at all once you open up to its possibilities as, in fact, a garden.
Well, thank you very much for enlightening us about this very particular and very beautiful garden.
Thanks, Nick.
You've been listening to Limelight Arts Travels podcast, A Closer Look. It was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and their elders past and present.